Hello, everyone. So just wanted to give everyone a quick welcome to the panel and also extend a big thank you to our guests for joining us today. I'll be giving everyone a chance to introduce themselves shortly, but I just kind of wanted to give a quick rundown on the panel first. So we'll be doing this on behalf of VanCaf, and the panel itself is called the Comic Craftworks panel. So craftwork is defined as an applied form of art, often a social and cultural product that kind of reflects the inclusive nature of the group or the folk imagination. And I always thought that was a really lovely sentiment. So I ended up kind of wanting to do a panel that revolved around the craft of comics, but especially the love for the comics medium, kind of especially in response to the current global situation and how everything is quite volatile, and a lot of people are sort of turning to the arts and stories in order to find some comfort. So we have a really great panel of guests. And without further ado, we'll move to some introductions. So I'm Ilinca Barbacuta. I'm primarily a writer, oftentimes an artist, usually a project organizer. And welcome to the panel where everything's made up and the points don't matter. Told you I was going to reuse that joke. So I'll turn it over to Teo to start off our introductions.
Okay. Hi, I'm Teo. I also go by Little Corvus online. My pronouns are they, them. I am a comic artist and illustrator. Let's see, what about me? I went to the School of Visual Arts, where I graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in cartooning. And I like to focus my work on positive diversity and with a lot of like fantasy and urban fantasy elements. I guess the person who got me started into comics was Mike Mignola's Hellboy. So after reading that was kind of when I decided I wanted to go to art school, which I feel like is a common thread for a lot of people. So yeah, I can't really think of anything else good for an intro. I hope that covered it for the most part.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. Okay. Great introduction. Naomi, turning it over to you.
Hi, I am Naomi Franky, also known as Naomi Frank, just the Q, on Twitter. I first got into comics, I guess, with Inuyasha, like floppy copies of the manga, where I thought Inuyasha was a girl for the longest time, because as a weebab, I didn't understand, gender binaries, yet, and his kimono looked pink on the cover. So for the longest time, I was like, yeah, it's a love story between two girls. It's fine. So my work, I focus a lot on character expression and just character-driven stories in general, which is pretty generic, I guess, but I like too many different genres to stick to one. And I went and got my BFA, my Bachelor's in Fine Arts in illustration at Florida State University. And that's about it. I just started getting into comics through tags on Twitter and just kind of rolled downhill from there, or uphill, that's better.
Thank you. Yoshi, turning it over to you.
Cool. All right. Hi, I'm Yoshi Yoshitani. So I got into comics with like Japanese manga mostly. I think for me, like a lot of my like comic book story comes around from being like half Japanese, mixed race. And for me, when I started reading Japanese comics, like it really hit me differently to be like, this is great because it's an appreciation of like Japanese culture that like I didn't have a lot of access to living in like a pretty white suburban neighborhood. And it was just like a great way to be like, I love stories and I love art, and this is like a great mashup of these two things. And it was just like a great way to experience other cultures besides like the one that I was experiencing growing up in. So it really meant a lot to me from that standpoint. And so that's just like where my like love of like comics grew, but also where a lot of my interest in creating art comes from is sort of making mashups of cultures that can kind of appreciate like, multiculturalism that is becoming like an increasing like point of issue in with people around the world, especially as we become like closer and tighter. And I think like, you know, especially speaking of the global pandemic that's happening right now, people are more and more online, and I think that we're connecting more and more, like even more than we were before. So it's a great time, a bad time, it's a great time mostly.
Uphill.
Uphill.
Can only go uphill from here. Thank you very much. Shazleen, turning it over to you.
I'm Shazleen Khan. I'm a UK-based illustrator and comics artist. I guess I got into comics when I was like really small because my parents used to read me like Tintin and Asterix. So my mom used to have like a big volume of Asterix. But I kind of didn't really engage with comics by myself until I got into like manga and a lot of shoujo and shonen stuff when I was like a young teenager. And then I made a comic when I was like 16 and I sold my soul, and that was it forever. I mainly make kind of like self-published stuff. And I think my most recent comic, Booza, is, I mean, I want it to be kind of like comfort food, like a comic that is welcoming and something that can be like a rest from everything else. Most of my commercial work is really political, and a lot of the comics I get hired for are really political. And I'm very tired of making stuff about being sad, and or stuff about being sad in a woman or sad in a woman and being gay. So I just wanted to make a comic that's fun. And I believe in that. Like, I believe in comics being something that can be empowering, something that can be a space to be like happy. Yeah.
No, it works very well, especially because like the recent comic you're working on, you named it after a comfort food.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great.
Exactly.
Thank you for that. Trump?
Hi, can you hear me at all? Okay, great.
Yes. Yes.
My name is Trung. I'm known as Trungles on the internet. I got into comics primarily because it was sort of an accident. Like when I was in college, I lost an internship because the local government shut down in the summer of 2011, and I was working at the Minnesota Historical Society at the time. And I was considered non-essential personnel, and so they eliminated my internship, and so I had to figure out something to do to fill my time, and I just started making comics and putting them on Tumblr. So that's kind of how I got started, and yeah, I started connecting with people and telling stories together. And I've always loved comics ever since I was really little, because I really like the notion of images as like handwriting. I think one of the things that really draws me into comic books is that it uses images as a part of its orthography, and it makes it really accessible for stories, especially if you're, you know, learning a new language, or if you're trying to make sense of a culture that you don't feel 100% a part of all of the time. It's a really wonderful point of entry for any and all literature. So comics is a great starting point, and as like a great pocket of literature in and of itself is something I'm really passionate about. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I really like too that you mentioned it as sort of, you know, pictures as words as well, because I remember talking to a lot of people who have kind of mentioned that they would read like doujinshi or foreign comics when they were growing up, not understanding the language, but getting into the story just from the art alone. So I really like that you've come back to that. And last but certainly not least, Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Blumenreich. I made the Spidey zine and the mini comic Full Court Crush, and I'm now working on the graphic novel Full Court Crush. And yay. And I got into comics, I don't know, because that's what my parents had around the house, like the Far Side and stuff. I read a lot of Betty and Veronica Double Digest because that was what they sold in the grocery store. And then around like high school, that was when the sort of US manga explosion happened. And so I started getting into that, and I really, really liked those things. And I read superhero comics because I thought they'd make me cool. No. No. But I think Jim Lee, the Batman comic Hush, was when I sort of had that like aha moment of like, oh, you can make a career out of this. So not a comic I'd reread, but a comic that has nostalgic value for me. And that's it. That's the end.
All right, well, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves and kind of giving everyone a sense of who we're talking to on this panel. I do really like that across the board, it kind of seems to be a combination of like manga and then like more classic comics like Asterix and, you know, Betty and Veronica. I actually have both manga and Asterix back there. So I like that everyone's stories kind of have different but similar starts. So I guess now that we've sort of looked at your comics past, it might be fun to go to the comics future. So kind of a question for everyone is sort of how would you like to see the future of comics change? And also how do you expect to see it change in the next year, 2 years, 5 years? Just sort of based on the current comic environment. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I guess like I don't know if this is so much of an answer, just like things that I'm really interested in is sort of like more and more of the emergence of webcomics. Like I know that this has been around for, you know, like I guess close to like 15 years now. But I think that it's interesting that we're seeing more and more like big companies start to like really put in like large chunks of publishing money into webcomics and the scene of that. I think Webtoons is obviously a great example of that. And just like the format that you read a comic in, and that is like tends to be like one long like single panel versus, you know, traditional publishing being like pages that you flip. Mm-hmm. So I just think it's like really interesting, like you know, and I think Emily Carroll is a good example of an artist who has taken like ways to take a web comic and sort of having the scroll feature affect how you interact with the story. So I guess like it's just something that I'm interested in, like seeing where it goes, because I think that we've really only touched like the basis of it, and like I, you know, like I said, it's just something I'm really interested in. I don't know if anyone else has like thoughts towards it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think it's a big move into, well, like I guess everyone can imagine why it's moved into that, right? Is because everyone's reading stuff on the phone. The comic I was talking about earlier, like the reason I made it is because it's so accessible, and that's amazing. Like you can read a comic in, like I take like an hour commute, or like actually a 2-hour commute to work. And on that commute, on that commute, I'd be reading like comics and stuff, and that's kind of what inspired me to make the comic I'm working on, is because you can sort of scroll on your phone, and it's like this tiny bite-sized thing. I mean, I think I agree with you. Like, I'd like comics to be more accessible. I mean, especially in the West, and I mean, I live in England. I feel like not comics are extremely niche here. I'd love to see them flourish more in this country. And for our comics scene to get a little bit more exciting, like more similar to like the US really. But I think like loads more publishers are also, like you said, like interested in comics, but also like interested in comics in ways that they weren't before. Like it's not just sort of your big two, Marvel and DC, like traditional book publishers are getting more and more into them. And I mean, looking at all of your guys' work, like you guys are amazing artists, right? And all of you guys are getting picked up by like I think a friend of mine's got picked up by Hachette and you know, like HarperCollins and you know, the big five publishers and stuff. And I think it's a really exciting time to be in comics right now. I feel like we're kind of entering, or like in the cusp of this really great era. It's just whether or not they gave us a budget for what we're making. But I'd like there to be, and I hope in the future that comics are seen as continuously like more viable, and something to really invest that money in. Yeah.
Okay. And I want to piggyback off of that, and actually what Yoshi said, where I like this trend of people, publishers treating comics as a more viable option, and then on top of that, treating them with not only as a viable option, but as like with respect, and seeing that trend grow. It's changed even since like I graduated college, which was really only 5 years ago, and like in 5 years it's changed so much. Mm-hmm. And so I'm actually working on a webtoon comic right now, and one of the reasons I, at first, I actually told them no, because I was like, this, I can't do this. Like, a scrolling format, like, it was just like, I couldn't tell how serious they were going to treat the comic, or if it was like a money thing. Like, I was just like very skeptical. And talking with them, not only were they serious about the story, which was about a Latinx family in Seattle. So they were looking for a Latinx Seattle-based artist, which honestly, that was maybe the first time I've ever had a job opportunity where they actually paid attention to that.
Mhm.
So that was like really nice to see, which I wouldn't have seen that. I hadn't really seen that in the like last couple years. So that was a really cool trend. And then on top of that, treating it like, hey, we're adapting this YA novel because we know some kids can't read like books for whatever reason. So we want to do a really loyal adaptation in this scrolling format so kids can access it on their phones as like an entryway into getting kids to read comics. So like just that kind of like sincerity was a really, really cool trend where it wasn't just because like, oh, comics are cool now, so we're gonna do like a cool webtoon. It was like, no, we love this story and we want this to happen, so like let's treat it with respect and make it happen. It's very genuine.
Knocking it back to Naomi.
Oh, Shaz, if you wanted to tag onto that, I saw your
I have
hand.
like one small thing. I guess I think it's also that respect for what kind of stories are becoming you know, like respected as well. Like when I was getting into university, I feel like the main stories were these kind of old, not old, but you know, like these very realistic or gritty kind of like stories by like kind of like old white people, right? But now like YA is really popular, and like fantasy comics or like sci-fi comics and sort of more genre fiction, and like you said, like fiction created by people of color and queer people, like that is being valued and seen as something important too, and that's a really great difference. That's all I really wanted to say.
Teo mentioned something about comics and that medium being treated with more respect, which I think is something that's increasing now that there are other publishers other than like the big two, Marvel and DC, putting out graphic novels. Like HarperCollins is doing that, Penguin's putting out comics, and those are companies that you would see at Scholastic book fairs when you were kids. I don't know if Scholastic had that in the UK as well.
No, not
Not
the
so
same
much.
way. Yeah,
Okay.
not the same way, but yeah, definitely. Like
Something like it.
even commercial book fairs, right? So
Right.
yeah.
But when we were like kids, you know, like in elementary school, like, you know, 10-year-olds, you know, younger, getting sent to school, book fairs with money to buy, you know, whatever they had at the fair, I would immediately go for the comics or like illustrated books, because duh. But, you know, when I was in college, I literally had a painting professor when I said I wanted to become an illustrator to do comics and or go into like storyboarding and things. He said, illustration, that's a 4-letter word, or like that's the L word. And I was like, what does the L word, what does that mean? And I still to this day don't understand
The lesbian
what the L
medium,
word
Naomi.
is. It's the lesbians. Illustration is the lesbians. You know, he wasn't completely off, it's fine. But still don't understand. But yeah, and then I went back to my university recently for a graduating artist show, like class gallery show, that I met one of the students who was participating in that show, and he wanted to make comics, and because I was a local artist who hadn't left, our town's kind of small, even though it's the capital of the state, I hadn't left, he was just like, this will be great to speak to someone who's working in the industry and share what I'm doing and get advice. And when I went to go see it and I spoke to other students who were taking classes there, and I kind of gauged what the reaction was to them going into digital art, because a lot of digital art and illustration and comics, they were getting a lot more encouragement. So I'm hopeful, I'm really hopeful that because it's no longer just like big two and superhero comics, that there are other publishers putting work out there that are in a wider range, that like we can have some really, really amazing stories coming up, really amazing art coming out. So
Yeah, it feels like it's become a lot more of a viable art form, which is really interesting to me too, because like you'll talk to a lot of writers and artists who will like say that they started off like reading comics as a kid, and then there's that sort of weird period where it's like almost a dirty word to kind of admit that you see it as a viable art form or a viable story form. So it's really cool to see it sort of turning into like this is an accessible art form for a lot of people, and we need a lot of different voices in it. So I guess kind of building on that, what's sort of like a medium design style that you want to see getting used more in comics, and what's something that you'd like to experiment with in your own comics? So like a good example would be how The Wicked and the Divine, for example, did one issue that was completely done as if it was a magazine format, which suited the kind of socio-political themes in that story very well. Have you guys ever had any thoughts about something you'd like to experiment with in your own work?
I guess I raised my hand. Hoyoshi and Teo talked about it. Like there's literally format changes with webtoons and mobile comics, literally physically changing the format and how comics are made and read, which impacts the story, like the emotional beats, the narrative beats differently than like a standard like on the page layout for a comic. And I can't remember the name of it, and I wish I wrote it down, but there was one webtoon that used the format of like the vertical scroll format to make it not just a comic, it was almost animated for how you had to scroll up the page up, so you were literally moving the images, the pictures, and it was this character falling down through space and like into a world and into the story, and I did slowly because I was just, ogling the art because that's what I do. But like if you went fast, quicker, it would actually look like it was moving. And I think that's really cool because comics is basically storyboarding, just, at different, paces and different structure. But it's kind of tying comics back to storyboarding and animation and like the idea of moving pictures. And I just think that's really neat. So yeah. I think it'd be really cool to see more of that, especially now digital and online comics, and just kind of tapping into other medium, like other not comics things, to incorporate those methods into the storytelling. That'd be really cool.
Yep, Yoshi.
Yeah, I think like I'm kicking myself because I can't remember the name, but there was this web comic that I was reading for a while. Like I think that came out like 10 years ago, but it had a lot of like super interactive elements to it. I think one of the reasons it isn't around anymore is because it was all JavaScript based, which obviously is not like a supported format anymore, which I think is like one of the things that's both interesting about the potential for ways of creating comics for the web, and then also like the potential tragedies that are that can fall from that when they're no longer supported. But I think like it had some really interesting elements. I remember where like it would have the kind of the regular comic, but it would have almost like dialogues that you could click and it would pop out to kind of like provide more information, or it would almost like reveal, like you would click things and it would reveal kind of hidden panels where it's like, okay, this is like a thought process that is actually happening that kind of like subsequently lead to more of the story. So it really helped take away from kind of like just the linear format and provided more of like kind of like the side tangents, the way that a choose your own adventure might have. And I think like things like that are super interesting, especially as you kind of investigate like stories that have kind of ambiguous time, or sort of, like I said, just ambiguity is really nice to capture in that. So it's something like I'd really be interested in. I think it's a lot of work, but I think that there are a lot of great possibilities.
Yes.
Hello? Yes.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I wasn't sure. Did Teo want to say something? I don't know who had their hand up.
No, it's you.
Okay. Sorry. I think, Yoshi, I know a comic like that. My friend Emma worked on one in like 2011 or something like that. But that sounds really like, because Neopets used to do stuff like that too, right? Like they used to have like event comics, and you like read like flash comics, and the dialogue would appear when you like hovered over stuff. Like I like to do that for myself too, like work in either like GIF animation or sound into comics, because I think is it Emily Carroll, the one we spoke about earlier? Yeah, she does stuff like that sometimes, right? Like sometimes there's like a little bit of sound or like parts of I know she's done one comic where as you're clicking through the pages, the adverts are actually part of the site and they change and become like more like creepy, right? I'd love to do stuff like that. Recently I saw a comic that's set in the 80s, and they created a whole website for it that's kind of that old like 80s or 90s styled really shit like website design. And that was so amazing, like to package up your comic in that way and create that kind of like limited format that will only exist for that kind of sort of small stage of time before the internet changes eventually. But I think that's really exciting still. Like, so yeah, I'd love to do more of that kind of stuff for myself.
Yep.
I don't know if anybody else had other questions, because I kind of just made me think of a question. Yoshi mentioned it like with JavaScript no longer being supported, and like things from that we grew up with back when, you know, albino black sheep and websites like that were a thing. Look, Neopets was already mentioned. We're all dating ourselves now. It's fine.
Yeah, I watched like this wave of nostalgia just wash over everyone.
Everybody.
As soon as Neopets
got flung back. But because I have friends who are trying to format their normal comics into webtoon comics, I think it'd be interesting to see like people who try to turn the other way around, like try to turn their web comics into something that's gonna outlast, you know, outdated internet service or outdated browser features like JavaScript or Flash. Like Adobe Flash is going out too.
Yeah.
So I think that'd be really interesting, because I know some comics maybe they'll be like, oh, this is the link to, you know, my SoundCloud for this comic or something, you know, like I went viral. Here's my SoundCloud. Read the comic.
Might be almost interesting to do like a horror comic where it's like literally like the technology is breaking down as you're reading this comic.
Yeah.
I know that was it Tokyo Pop for a while there was trying to translate some of their like some popular webtoons. Like I think they did Mega Tokyo, and like there were a few I know there were a few others I remember that there were like that were being published online as like web comics. They got enough traction on their own individual websites and then were like subsequently being published. I know that like even still like I think like Dark Horse has done a couple. I know they did like Bird Boy for a second there, but I think like it is interesting because some of those comics do like, because it is made for the web, they have like a long form panel, and then that somehow has to get chopped up into like 3 pages to sort of handle that. But yeah, no, I think it is interesting. I mean, like I think that in some ways that having like these physical comics, they can reside in someone's basement for longer and then kind of reemerge in the light of day. Whereas like some of these websites, like again, they like don't exist anymore, or like, I don't know. But then again, you could be like My Immortal and people will protect you forever. So
national treasure, an international treasure. Yeah, sorry to, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but my comic I'm working on right now is kind of an experiment in that I'm trying to get something that works as a scroll to also work as like a physical comic. So I kind of reverse engineer it, so the pages are designed as like how it would sit in a book first, and then I kind of reorganize all the panels to work in that scroll. But I definitely feel like it's still limiting, because when you're trying to work in multiple formats and trying to think like, okay, well, I need it to work in print, and also I need it to work online, and I need to work on a screen this big and the screen that's going to be like that, like something also always kind of gives, And that's a real struggle, both like in terms of right now where we're working on comics in different formats, but also in the future where we're thinking of formats that kind of don't exist right now. You can't really guess for that. But I think that's kind of the beauty of comics. Like they're this kind of like finite medium, and they're only going to be circulated for so long. Kind of that energy of how it's being circulated now is, for me at least, like the most beautiful part about it. But I think, yeah, I'm excited to see what will come in the future.
It's interesting because it's like, on the one hand, almost a time capsule, but also like very there one moment, gone the next, but it's something that will kind of stick with you for a while. So it's kind of actually building on that and moving from sort of format to theme. And Trung and Hannah, I'm going to pick on the both of you a little bit here because you both have some pretty great original graphic novels coming out. What, in creating stories, what prevalent themes have you found come up a lot in your personal work? And is this something that you gravitate towards in your hired work and collaboration, since you've both done pretty significant work with some pretty big names?
I generally like to focus on very quiet moments and everyday moments. And I like focusing on character a lot. And I like sort of building worlds that people exist in, not necessarily on like a grand epic scale, but just like this is someone's personal space where they live, and this is like the connections to their friends and family and just people they see, and just sort of crafting that kind of environment. Crafting it, my God. That's kind of what I like to do, and I like to be more character driven instead of plot driven.
Mm-hmm.
That's about it. What was the rest of that question?
Just in your hired work, do you find yourself sort of gravitating or seeking out these themes, or are you more kind of like, it's paying me, I'm going to do the job?
Oh no, the first one. I definitely like to try and latch on to the things I like to do, mostly because I think it's probably my own limitations. I'm not a very big like action-y person, but it's also because it doesn't interest me. Mm-hmm. So it's something that I don't develop further as a skill, but it's also something that I don't want to develop further as a skill. So, but then if I get hired to do something else, it's kind of about trying to make that match. If they want something that's more action-y, and trying to make that work with what I like and what I can do. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't.
It is what it is, I guess, in that case. But like, one of the things that I've always gravitated towards your work in particular is you're very good at these character moments and making them feel very real. Speaking of someone who's also very good at those, Trung.
I am still kind of figuring out my process because I've only ever done kind of relatively short work, and I've usually collaborated with writers, and I'll draw the comics. And so I'm kind of figuring out what my story beats are like and how to explore a narrative in my own way. And I love the way that you framed the question, because I feel like when we're studying literature and when we're reading any piece of work, we tend to like to think about themes in terms of like, oh, we're going to connect the dots. But I'm discovering that actually you can't really go theme first. At least for me personally, I have to start with telling a good story and figuring out where the characters are. I like to think that I'm going to have like really strong themes all the way throughout my story, but those things don't occur to me until much, much later, where I'm like, oh, this is a pattern that I'm seeing. How can I accentuate that a little bit? And that seems to be how I go about my work. So I like to think of myself as a big picture person, but I'm actually kind of more character driven, it turns out. Which is fun. And I think that's the fun of comics. You get to discover the way that you like to envision and like craft a world, and it surprises you sometimes, which is really cool. I think one of the things that Hannah mentioned is that she's like very kind of character driven. She gives them quiet moments. And I think that's really important in terms of storytelling as well. Like Hannah in particular does this wonderful thing where she takes characters from franchises that are action oriented, that we think of as being very bombastic, and she gives
And
them very
ruining
human
them.
moments. Yes, just like absolutely. And you know what? You're just destroying all of our feelings like every time you post like a small comic. And I think that's something that people are really hungry for. Like we really want to see characters have quiet moments where you kind of feel like you can sit next to them and like really be with them. And that's kind of it's sort of an overlooked way to tell stories, is to kind of just give them quiet moments that like might be regarded on paper as kind of boring, but you get to them as a reader and you're like, oh, like I actually have an emotional investment in this world. I can fill this quiet space with my own thoughts and my own feelings, which is really clever.
All I love is boring comics. I just want boring
Just
stories
slice of life
all day long.
all the time.
I just want everyone to have a good day.
Yep.
Yeah.
In this comic, nothing happens and the ending's good. The end.
No, I do really like what you mentioned too, how like when you're writing it, you don't really notice the theme until you're sort of looking at it later. And it's really interesting kind of looking at someone's body of work, like Shazleen, Naomi, and Teo. If you look at their work, they all have like this really strong sense of like finding your family and finding your identity. And it's it's really cool to see how they're both, you know, interpreting that, but it's also like Shazleen says, it's comfort food. But it's interesting how it's only when you kind of step back from the work and you look at it, you're like, oh wow, sure write a lot of characters that have identity issues. And I guess kind of building on that, because a lot of you have mentioned that you kind of, you know, consider character over plot. Question for everyone, but sort of when creating a story, what do you use as the central pillar? So this can be anything from the design of it in terms of a consistent color palette, like Yoshi, your color work is fantastic, or in kind of in terms of plot where you find that central theme or that recurring motif and then you just kind of keep coming back to that.
Oh, me and Naomi keep like putting our hands up.
Fine, you can go first.
No, you go first this time because you let me
Okay.
go last time.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I love a combination of all the things that you like brought in. Like I know a lot of comics will use like a central color theme, like a either monochromatic color theme throughout the whole story, or just like a color theme for a character's costume or something maybe. But I love to think of color in a scene as changing with the story and changing with the characters. And this is something that's used in animation a lot and in film, where the color, the hue of the whole overall scene, whatever is happening in that moment, is indicative of what the characters are going through. So I'd love to see that in comics a lot more too, especially like if character, usually I see a lot more in like psychedelic scenes, like if the character's on a trip or if going through like some kind of like magical wormhole or something, and the colors get all wild and trippy. But I'd love to see like, if a character's going through like a strong pivotal moment, I'd love to see like the color palette reflect that. And it may not be like realistic, you know, but honestly, it's comics. I don't care. I don't mean like I know what the character looks like. I want like to be so absorbed in the moment that, you know, I don't notice that the characters are like lime green and blue or something. Like if it fits with the scene and it fits with the energy of it, I just dive into it, you know. I guess that could be a recurring motif too in a story, if that's a pattern that you use either in a book or throughout the series or something. Like I pushed it a lot when I was working recently with Dark Horse on Harrow County Death's Choir, or Tales from Harrow County. A lot of the scenes were set in these dark kind of like moody environments and things, but like I pushed one with like the police lights going off, where I completely abandoned like the kind of natural like greens and earthy colors of like the forest, the setting, and just pushed everything to be like the blues and purples and magentas of it, because it fit the energy and the mood of it. And I'd love to do that more. Like I don't get to color my own comics that often. I usually just do line work, but I'd love to play with that more if I can get the chance to.
Fingers
Yes.
crossed. Shazly, back to you.
I guess I'll talk more about like plot stuff. I mean, I've been writing this really big comic, but then I've also been like trying to seed other little comics and some more shorter things. I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of genre stuff. I guess I'll talk a little bit about like autobio and nonfiction as well. Because a lot of my nonfiction is autobio. So a lot of that kind of stuff is usually like I'll find one single thing, like a thing happened to me, or like a thing I've like seen, and it just kind of sparks like a whole conversation. And I find a lot of my narrative stuff is like that too, but maybe on a like wider macro scale, where like I'm really focused in on like this thing. So a comic I'm trying to work on right now is that like experience of not realizing that you're gay yet, and being in like a really small community, and then that like horrible sapphic feeling of like, oh my god, I love this girl, she's my best friend, and you don't realize you're gay. And like that feeling, like that tiny feeling, and then creating like and spinning like a whole narrative around that. Like I kind of use that feeling as like a pillar in most of my work, like whether it's that, or if it's like you said, that found family, or like there's a comic I made a while ago. It was like a 16-page comic about basically these two little boys are like they're telling a story, and the idea is that like they're sort of telling this story, and it's that feeling of being with your cousins when you're a kid, and those kind of fun times you'd have like in summer, maybe like playing games and stuff, but also that sense of foreboding. They one of them's convinced that there's a giant monster in the sky that's going to come, and the other one's like, no, and in the end you find out there is a monster. But it's always something like that, something really simple, kind of like what Hannah said, these like really small moments that I'd like to expand upon and create like a sort of journey for your audience to like follow along with that.
Oh, that's really cool. Thank you. Trung, I think you had one too.
Yeah, I was going to talk about like the way that I have been writing kind of longer stories, and I'm learning now. I'm saying that a lot. Like I'm just figuring this stuff out because I didn't go to art school. I didn't, take any classes for writing. I have no idea how to do any of these things, so I'm sort of teaching myself as I go along. And one of the things that I'm learning is that when I'm working on a really long narrative project, I kind of think about it in terms of oil painting, or like painting a really large piece, where you kind of like have, where you start with really broad strokes, and then you kind of push and pull different shapes depending on what it is that you're, trying to discover in order to flesh out the story. And it's probably not the most expedient way to go about telling a story, but when you have enough room to like really kind of push and pull different character moments in different directions and be really intentional about your characters' motivations, I think that kind of broad strokes and then like detail work later on is something that applies to storytelling in a way that surprises me. So I always find that to be really cool, like in particular, especially in contrast to the way that I used to tell like shorter stories. Like I'm a person who does a lot of like fairy tale retellings, and so the bones of the story are kind of already there, and then trying to figure out like what goes on it and like what textures make it necessarily different and of a different time and of a different perspective than what you would expect it to be. Those are all things that kind of go on later, but you kind of have to have the broad strokes in order to have a place to put things in terms of like those character moments and those story moments.
It's a lot easier to write and then edit than it is to edit while you're writing.
Exactly, yeah.
I guess kind of building off of that, because everyone's sort of, like gone in on kind of what inspires them and how they sort of like to start their process. A bit of a bigger question and a bit of a more personal one. In the context of your stories and your craft, kind of what would you consider your personal voice? So not necessarily what sets you apart, although that is obviously part of it, but kind of what perspective do you bring to your work, or are you trying to bring your work, and like what does your work aim to say?
I guess like I'll just start off here. But I mean, like I had mentioned before that for me, a lot of like multiculturalism is like really important to me, and just like how different cultures both can stand separate from each other, but also intermingle with each other. And like ways that we can appreciate, like I said, the individual cultures, but also the new mixes that form from that. So again, that's important in my personal work, but I also try to slip that in any sort of hired work I get. So because I did the comic book for graphic novel for Zatanna for DC, where like she's this young girl. It's like kind of a retelling-ish. But I mean, like, she's basically like this kind of whitish girl in sort of like a whitish suburbia, and like magic happens. So it's like nothing there is like particularly lends itself for too much like multiculturalism. But they're like, yeah, she travels through like a magical house, and they're like, I don't know, whatever you think a magic house looks like. And I'm like, cool, well, I'm gonna put like every single like an homage to like every single culture I can, and like all the background elements. So she keeps going through different rooms in the house, and like keeps like, you know, there's like, oh, here's like some like Chinese stuff, and like here's like a little bit of an Arabic pool up here, you know, like little things that are just kind of in there to be like, hey, like, you know, there's more than one form of magic out there. And I think that that's like something to enjoy. Not everyone catches it, but like I definitely have had people that'll be like, oh, I really like how it really feels like she's like traveling through the world, and she's like experiencing different, you know, lifestyles than just like her own. And I think that also helps like give her kind of a feeling of like growing up and experiencing things outside of her like small suburbia. So I think there are small ways that you can bring in your themes even into hired work.
No, absolutely. Naomi?
Yoshi brought up like the idea of multiculturalism and being mixed race, and I feel like even if you don't try to actively like put your experience into your stories, I feel like sometimes it inadvertently slips in there. Like a lot of my stories that I either tell myself or the ones that I gravitate towards too with my like hired work are stories that have an opportunity for that split, that dichotomy of trying to find family, find a foothold, find a meaning or purpose. Like in Spanish, there's a phrase that "nay de aquí, nay de allá." It's like you're not from here, you're not from there. And I feel like, especially as like a first-gen American or like mixed race person, you have like your foot on either side of like a cultural gap or a line dividing it. So I feel like in stories, I really like themes or trying to tell the story of someone trying to straddle or navigate some kind of divisive line and either embrace the line or like erase it entirely, or, you know, just handling that kind of narrative in whatever way fits the story, whatever way fits the plot. Those are, I don't know, those always really attract me.
You're kind of trying to balance two worlds and either making a completely new one or having to choose one over the other.
Yeah, it could be like realistic, like literal, like cultural, like multicultural thing, or it could just literally be girl, suddenly magic stuff happens, you know, Sailor Moon stuff. Gotta be a, you know, Sailor Senshi fighter over here protecting the world, and also have to go to high school. What am I gonna do? You know, it's always a fun dichotomy. I guess it is a really old school too, because a lot of early anime was that.
It's a classic character, like a story trope for a reason. Trung, I saw you.
Yeah, no, I kind of just wanted to piggyback off of that, and that whenever we, you know, I think comics are uniquely suited to tell stories about really complicated things because it's more accessible that way. And I think one of the things that I always struggle with in my storytelling is that, like, we all come from backgrounds where we, you know, engage in discourses in really intentional ways, and it comes with a particular syllabus. And one of the things that I am kind of fascinated by is what happens when you don't have access to that particular language to discuss things that might be really difficult or that might be very kind of esoteric and particular to your experience. And I think one of the things that I really try to keep in mind in terms of storytelling, because of course my stories also contend with a lot of intercultural, like cross-cultural communication and all of the difficulties that go into that fraught relationship between language and culture and what happens when you come from two different spaces. And comics is kind of uniquely equipped to make sure that you talk about these things from the character's material concerns, so that you're not sort of mired in like the particularities of how to discuss this academically. You're thinking about like, oh, like what in my like total empathetic capacity do I imagine people might materially need from each other, from their communities, in order to, you know, make the decisions that they make and navigate their days. And so it kind of puts you in a frame of mind where you're really working to meet people where they are. And I think that's really wonderful.
I really like how a lot of your work has to deal with community, and kind of like you mentioned a few times language, because I remember that comic you posted a little while ago about how you realized that you wouldn't be able to speak the same language as your younger self anymore.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that got me. Kind of building off that, and because I noticed someone was a little quiet, Teo, just sort of bouncing it over to you, just because I know a lot of your work has to deal with kind of this melding of cultures, as we discussed, but also sort of the language and the community of both family and found family. So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, I guess when I focus on that stuff, which is like, it's a theme of every single piece of personal work I do, which I don't actively make that decision, but it's just like kind of therapeutic in this, that's the stories I want to tell. Something that has really impacted me with like telling these stories of like, I'm mixed race, I didn't fit in with in the white suburbia I grew up in, and I didn't fit in with my mom's side of the family. My siblings and I, like, we didn't grow up speaking Spanish because my mom wanted us to be able to speak English, and then like having these experiences where people would shame me or like my siblings and my mom for not speaking Spanish, like all these conflicts where you kind of grow up internalizing a lot of isolation and kind of thinking like thinking that you're maybe like alone in your kind of horrible experiences, and then taking those experiences. And I never make comics about myself like physically like with a likeness, but like all of the characters that are like the main characters in my stories are like a part of myself. So I'm telling these stories where like it can't directly link back to me, but it is like my experiences, and putting those stories out into the world and then getting responses back from people, whether they're also mixed race Latinx or like even if they're not mixed race, but you know, they're immigrants, like first gen, having people come up to you and be like, your story was my story, even though it was a fantasy setting and the main character was like not a human, but it was about mixed race identity, and like realizing that you're not alone and you're really connecting with people is really one of the reasons I love comics, is that you can really have these emotional connections with strangers and kind of maybe, if anything, maybe bring some light to people's lives. That's why I also like to focus on the positive, diverse comics, because we don't need any more like any marginalized identity doesn't need any more sadness. So like if there's anything I can do where you're exploring that isolation but also bring it to a place of healing, I think is really important and a really good power that comics has.
Triumph through kindness and hope instead of the alternative.
Yes.
Anna, yeah.
Right, like Cheslene was saying earlier, that you like your comics to feel like comfort food, and I'm totally on board with that. Like that's where I go as well, where it's like just creating a space that feels just like a comfort blanket, and is just like a safe space, without like sugarcoating anything and without being like overly saccharine about it or saying that bad things don't exist, but at the same time being like, this is a place that's okay to be and nothing really bad is going to happen here. And, you know, I'm going to take care of you, my gentle reader. Just come here. I will tell you a story. And just kind of having that kind of overarching sort of feeling to the whole the whole of the comic or the story is important, I think.
No, I think we're all pretty much in agreement that we're looking for comfort here. Yoshi?
Yeah, I just wanted to just kind of tap on what Teo was saying, and also kind of circling back to sort of the beginning of what we're talking about, like the future of comics. And I say this about like a comics and also just kind of like generally a lot of media, but I'm really excited about sort of like, so the stories that I read when I was younger, and I know that that's like what affected my generation, and seeing like what my generation is creating now based on like the books that they were able to read when they were younger, it gets me really, really excited about like the stories that we're going to see in like another 15 years from now. Like, who is growing up with the stories that we're telling now, and they're going to feel like even more, you know, empowered to just create like even more like great stories. Like, I think about like the YA scene, for instance. Like, I remember when I was younger reading like Alana, that was like one of these first ones where it was like, oh wow, she has like multiple love interests. Like, wait, like she can actually like experience love like multiple times and differently each time. What? You know, and like and I think like, you know, also like how she expressed her gender identity was like sort of different at the time too. And just kind of seeing like people who are influenced by that and like what they're creating now. And again, like I said, what we're going to see like 10, 15 years from now, just, I get really excited, you know, like more stories about multiculturalism. I can't wait to see what's going to happen like in the future. I think we're just going to keep seeing like more and more like nuanced stories and experiences that that aren't seeing as much light now, but I definitely expect for them to keep being pushed forward.
You actually set me up really well for my last question, so thank you. I didn't even have to pay you for that. But
You should, though.
I really should. I'm going to Venmo you after. But before we get to that, I do want to say that knowing all of your guys' work and knowing the themes that you bring in, I think the generation that's influenced by you guys is going to be fucking kick-ass. Like, I'm really excited to see the work that comes not only from you, but comes from people inspired by you, because you're all great storytellers. You all do amazing work, and it is a privilege to know all of you and your work. So sort of building on all that, not to get too sappy, but I kind of wanted to end this panel on a bit of more of a fun note. So 2 questions. You can choose to answer both of them or none of them or just one of them. But if your work was rediscovered 100 years from now, what would you want it to say about you? And, or what is your dream comic to make, assuming unlimited budget and time? Okay, we'll do Naomi first, because that's the first hand I saw.
Oh, Hannah, did you go?
No, you go.
No? Okay. Ilinca, you already know what this one is. There's absolutely a space adventure story that I want to tell that has nothing to do with like, oh, space aliens or spaceships and all the normal space adventure nonsense. And like, if I had unlimited time and like money to just dive into it, this would just be a massive like interstellar introspective on like what it is to live, what it is to be alive through like different perspectives, and not just through like human perspective, but like fictional cultural perspective and like alien perspective, and just be able to really dive into like a major think piece. Just, and nobody will read it. I don't even care. I just want to make it, you know, and just ask these questions that I shout into the void all the time, but then make it into a comic. It's a void comic. That's all. Give me money for that, please.
Yoshi, go ahead.
Okay, I think like if we're talking about dream comics that I want to make, I definitely, I think it was interesting people talking about Inuyasha earlier, because for me, I was actually way more influenced by Ranma 1/2. Not only because like there are some weird gender fluid aspects going on in there, but also just like, it was just like a comic that's like pure fun. Like, it doesn't even matter really what order you read any of the sequences in. It's just kind of like, I don't know, it's just like pure fun. And it's mostly characters who are just ridiculous. And it's just like, it's just super enjoyable. You're like, I just want to hang out here. This is great. I think like I think Inuyasha was like also good, but there was a lot of feelings. There's a lot of drama there, and I just want to make a comic that's like just super ridiculous, like, you know, the weird mistaken identities, but it doesn't actually hurt anyone, you know, just fun stuff.
That's awesome. I love that. Teo?
Okay, so one of my dream projects that I'm getting closer and closer to, once everything's back to normal in the world, I might just do it. I have a road trip, paranormal, like mystery, mild horror comic I really want to make. And part of the aspect of the story is like a road trip across the United States, retracing the main character's footsteps, because him and his mom, like when they like growing up, like they were pretty nomadic. Mm-hmm. So he's retracing all of the places he grew up in and stopped when he was, you know, young. And I kind of like along the lines of like American Gods, I would want to incorporate real American places into the story and kind of make the story based on my own journey physically across the United States. And I would have to have a reliable car and like to be in that many motels for a long time. But if I could just like have someone be my patron and like pay me
Teo, let's get a camper. Let's go together.
Yes, and like really cute. Yes, I love it. I would that, and then like paying someone to make like an original soundtrack for the graphic novel, like having it be a whole like immersive road trip experience. None of this is like possible right now, but that would be like peak goal for me.
So nice.
A soundtrack for the road trip that we are going to be taking. It'll be perfect.
Mm-hmm. And our cute little paper.
That would be amazing. Chaz, Trung, Hannah, would you guys like to chime in at all?
Go, Trung.
Do you want to go first, Hannah?
I do not.
Do you have a? Okay, all right. I think without like any constraints on time or resources or anything like that, like I think ideally the stories that I like to tell, like I know, like I could retell any fairy tale. Like I would love to just continue doing that. But I think like in my heart of hearts, I would really like to be able to quietly and like slowly tell a very, very, very long story over a long period of time. I think like I love reading graphic novels and I love reading like, you know, like floppy comics, and anything with a contained story is really great. But I also grew up reading a lot of like Sunday comics and like Calvin and Hobbes. I read so much Garfield when I was a kid. And like over the decades, there eventually develops like a continuity, and you get like a strange sense of familiarity with the world and the characters that way. And I would love to be able to tell a story that way, like to just have the resources and have the personal gusto to just sit down and like spend time with the same cast of characters over the next like 3 or 4 decades. That would be cool.
That's amazing. I really like how they've come back to like the comfort food you keep coming back to.
We're all just hungry. Talking about hungry.
I think we're all just hungry.
We just need to eat.
Well, no, the problem is that I had like Jasleen's comic right beside me, so I've just been thinking about dumplings.
It's just like subliminal messaging on the side, like you need to eat now.
Oh my god.
I guess, I don't know, it would be cool to do like an adaptation of something, not because it's something that's being sort of farmed out or hired, but like something I'd pick. It would also be cool to just get paid a whole lot of money to do whatever the fuck I want for whenever I want to, and that would be ideal.
I will your work on the ending story, like
that's exactly what I was thinking of, Ilinca, so thank you for bringing that up. That would be cool because that movie is garbage, and I know a lot of people have a lot of nostalgic attachment to it, but it's not good. Don't rewatch it. Let it live in a nostalgic memory. It's so bad.
Not even the one with Jack Black?
Oh, that one's fine. That's a masterpiece.
Jesus Christ.
Sorry, Naomi.
Look at you.
If it makes you feel better, that movie was basically a horror movie to me as a kid. It scared the crap out of me.
But otherwise, I feel like really comfortable where I am now, which is nice. I feel very much that I'm working on things I want to be working on. I'm very close to moving in a direction I want to be moving in, and that's a very new feeling, and I'm really happy about it. So, yeah.
Shazleen, last but not least. Yes, I've used that joke twice. It's fine.
I'm vibing a lot with Hannah right now. I'm like, yeah, me too. I feel you, both on the comfort food, but also on the being quite comfortable where I am. I feel like the comic I'm making right now is a comic that I just want. Like, it would be great if someone paid me and was a beautiful patron and gave me like $1 million money, and I could just sit here on my laurels and write this comic forever. But alas, I suppose if I had another project I'd like to make, I would like to be able to go back and do like adaptions of stuff. I feel like no one hires me for that, so I just love to actually just be allowed to go and read some classic novels and like particularly like look back at characters who have been horribly butchered by Orientalism and reclaim them and make them good. That's all I want to do really. But until then.
Actually, one of the talking points for why I suggested you for the panel was because you're really good at like adaptations. Like I had your Carmilla comic back there too.
You.
Really, this panel is just so I can like talk about how great you guys are.
Thank you.
But thank you for your time and for all this great insight and for dealing with me wiggling my hands the whole time. It was really great talking to you all. I guess, does anyone have any closing words they'd like to say, or are we good to wrap? Yoshi?
Oh yeah, I guess just like quick wrap up. I think it'd be great if everyone could just like drop their social media really quick, or like places to find each other. So I'm Yoshi Yoshitani, and on Twitter I'm at Yoshi Squared. So find me there primarily, and then YoshiYoshitani.com.
Amy?
I'm Naomi Franky again. You can find me literally on all social media at Naomi Frank. So it's just FRANQ. And my website is naomifrankys.com.
I'm Hannah Blumenreich, and my Twitter handle is hblumenreich. So you gotta spell my last name to pass. It's BLUMENREICH, and if you make it, my avatar is a picture of a butt. So that's how you know.
You can't change it now, ever.
I can't.
You're legally obliged to keep it that way.
I haven't found an image that's better anyhow, so. It's only bad when I have to tweet serious things, and then it's like, oh.
Oh, that is a butt.
That's a butt.
Teo, I guess?
Oh, yeah, I'm Teo. I go pretty much only by Little Corvus online. I say online, I'm pretty much only on Twitter. My website is littlecorvusart.com. And I guess disclaimer that on my Twitter handle, I actually go by Oscar Isaac's Ethnic Hips. So don't look for my actual name there. I treat Twitter really seriously.
So serious.
So serious.
This is like the most serious panel you've ever been on. Like, no.
Oh, yeah.
Trung?
I'm Trung, and you can find me as at Trungles basically everywhere. So I'm at Trungles, TRUNGLES on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook as well sometimes, but I post there very intermittently. And my website is just trungles.com.
Branding.
Chaz?
Yeah, I'm Shazleen Khan. My name is very uncommon, so you could type in Shazleen Khan and you'll get me on Twitter. But my handle on there is Neon Lanterns. My website is shazleenkhan.com, and I do have an Instagram under my like Neon Lanterns handle. I think it's neonlanterns.jpg, but I clearly don't post there very often. But you can also read my webcomic Boozer on Tapas and Webtoon.
Nice. Thank you, everyone. I'm Ilinca Barbacuta. Also, if you Google that, I'm pretty much the only one you're ever going to find. I can never commit a crime for it. You can mostly find me on Twitter at Ilinca Barbacuta, where I should post about Inuyasha. But thank you again to everyone. This was a really amazing panel, and thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you
hosting.
moderating.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Just gonna stop.